But welcome to our Substack Live conversation today at Redeeming Democracy, where we bring you research and analysis on religion, racial justice, and the moral work of democracy. This is only the second Substack Live event we've done, but we'll be bringing you many more of these opportunities in 2026, along with weekly analysis in the newsletter and monthly author salons covering new books in this area. But today, my guest for President's Day, that's kind of auspicious, is Kim Whaley, who's an expert in constitutional law and the separation of powers. She is professor of law at the University of Baltimore, right up the street for me, School of Law. She is also a legal contributor for ABC News and You say it's ZTO? I've always ZTO's
I think it's Zateo.
Zateo. All right, there we go. It's Zateo. She was also an assistant United States attorney in the Washington, D.C. office. And she's also the author of, you won't want to miss these, a nice series of books, actually. What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, How to Read the Constitution and Why, and How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why. And she also writes the Little Law School Substack. So be sure you click over and subscribe to that. So welcome, Kim.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, you and I were recently together at a conference on religion and democratic resilience at the University of Cambridge. And you gave a really engaging keynote address about this phenomenon of legal authoritarianism. Now, let me say that again, legal authoritarianism, and that we're experiencing here in the US. And so we're going to get into that. But you opened your talk with, I thought, a very engaging imaginary address to a jury. So I'm wondering if you just kind of kick us off maybe with that address that you gave to the jury to set the table for our conversation today.
Sure, happy to do that. So imagine to our viewers that you're sitting in a jury box and you'll know pretty quickly which case I'm talking about. And as I speak, ask yourselves, what does this have to do with legal authoritarianism, which seems like an oxymoron? So here it goes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about politics. It is not about policy. It is not about who won or lost an election. This case is about whether one man, entrusted with the highest office in the land, chose to corrupt the machinery of democracy itself so that he could remain in power after the people had rejected him. The evidence has shown that Donald J. Trump lost the 2020 presidential election. He knew he lost. Instead of accepting that result, he launched a coordinated multi-step scheme to overturn it, not through recounts or court rulings, but through deception, pressure, and obstruction. Again and again, you heard evidence how his claims of fraud were investigated and rejected by state officials, by federal judges, by his own Department of Justice, and by his own campaign lawyers. He was told repeatedly that there was no evidence that could change the outcome. And yet he chose to lie about the claims he knew were false. He pressured state officials to, quote, find, unquote, votes that did not exist. He sought to replace legitimate electors with fake ones. And when all else failed, he summoned a crowd to Washington, aimed them at the Capitol, and refused to call off the mob while the Constitution was under attack. This was not confusion. This was not negligence. This was not protected speech. This was a criminal conspiracy, a conspiracy to defraud the United States, a conspiracy to obstruct the lawful counting of electoral votes, a conspiracy to deprive millions of citizens of their right to have their votes counted. When the Capitol was breached, when officers were attacked, when lawmakers fled for their lives, the defendant did not call off the mob. He did not defend the Constitution he swore to uphold. He watched. He waited, and he hoped the violence would succeed where his schemes had failed. The defense may tell you that this is about criminalizing politics. That is wrong. In this courtroom, titles do not matter. Power does not matter. The law matters. So today, on behalf of the United States, we ask you to return a verdict of guilty and send the message that no one, not even a former president, is above the law. And then, as you know, Robbie, I go on to say this, of course, is a fiction because there was no trial. There were no closing arguments. There was no jury verdict. In the case of the United States versus Donald J. Trump, that was brought by special counsel Jack Smith. And that the reason it didn't happen is because a majority of unelected justices on the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, put a stop to it and actually ruled effectively that Donald Trump is above the law. And we are seeing the cascade of legal atrocities, frankly, and norm-busting behavior that is leaving people reeling, many millions of people reeling. But some of us, I know yourself included, were predicting this for quite a while. So I'm not all that surprised, particularly in light of Trump versus U.S.
Yeah, well, I have to say when you gave that opener, I wasn't quite expecting, so my wife's a performance studies scholar, teaches theater at GW, and, usually keynote addresses, I mean, they're long on facts and long on, but they're not all that great on performance, but I really appreciated the opening, so you're dusting off your US attorney, skills, there to address the jury, and I have to say I saw a comment in the, something in the comments here, like, "I wish that's how it would have gone." And it did bring back to me this sense of, uh, watching West Wing, back in the day, the TV show and, like, thinking like, "Oh, that's the way the government should work. That's the way the law should work." Like, these are the kind of ideals that we think of when we think of the country. But you go on to say this, in that talk, you said that the result is that the U.S. constitutional order that has been in place in some form or another since 1788 is over.
Mhm.
And you say, as one Minneapolis resident said at the latest murder by ICE agents, to be in the U.S. feels like performing CPR on a corpse, and the corpse is the U.S. Constitution. Now, that's a pretty stark evaluation. Is it really that bad? How bad is it?
Yeah, it's bad. It's that bad. I mean, we will never have a constitutional order again than we had on January 20th at 11:59 a.m., 2025, when Donald Trump took office the second time. Um, and I think the thing that people don't necessarily understand about the Constitution, it seems, heady, and for lawyers and scholars and things, or historians, it's really about human nature and human behavior. And the Constitution is only meaningful if it's enforced. That is, if people worry, I mean, the president has so much power. President has the nuclear codes, has the FBI, the CIA, the entire U.S. military, this massive multi-million person apparatus that is the federal executive branch, all this authority and power. There's incentives to abuse it. And the framers understood this. James Madison in Federalist Number 51, if men were angels, we would not need
Mm.
government. So the reason right now the constitutional order is over is there are no disincentives to violating the Constitution anymore. They've all gone. And they started in the first Trump administration. The impeachment failed twice for very serious allegations. That is basically not spending appropriated money to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. Um, the second impeachment was around
That
January
seems sort of
6th.
quaint now, doesn't it?
Yeah,
That
it does
charge.
seem very quaint.
Yeah.
And then the second impeachment was around January 6th.
Yeah.
And Mitch McConnell, then Senate Majority Leader, stood up on the floor and said, listen, he's the one who thwarted that for these technical reasons, and said it's the legal system, the rule of law will take care of it. And then the Supreme Court gave him immunity. So, if you know that so long as the court said, as long as he uses his official power, which you just cloak it in something official, you have somebody in the room, or there's lots of ways because the court didn't define what that means. So as long as it's dressed up on, presidential letterhead, something like that, um, he knows that he's untouchable, and he's said this. So the Constitution has now become a piece of paper. It's not functioning to restrain abuses of power. We're seeing this with the due process clause, with deporting people with no due process, no notice, no hearing, to countries where they'd be tortured or killed. We're seeing this with the Fourth Amendment searches and seizures based on racial profiling, not based on reasonable suspicion of commission of crime. We've had two onlookers, bystanders murdered in the streets. Those people are not being held accountable. We've seen many, many transgressions of the First Amendment, which is core to our Constitution. I mean, you're an expert in religious liberty. We've had, Don Lemon, former CNN anchor, who has a pending indictment against him, literally, and another reporter, because they covered uh, a, a protest inside a church that was against Donald Trump's ICE. So we're getting normalized, Robbie, to these things, and everyone, I think, is searching for, well, here's a light in the tunnel, and not understanding we are so outside the football field. I mean, we are miles away from the constitutional order. I mean, the any one of these things would have been,
Yeah.
impeachable, history making type news, and we're just absorbing it.
Yeah. I just want to pause on a couple of these things too that, you know, you think back about impeachment, how few elected officials it would have taken to convict, right? And prevent him from running for office again. I mean, it was a handful of Republicans that we needed to stand up and do that. And the truth is, I keep coming back to this. It's still only a handful of Republicans in Congress today that we need to put a stop to a lot of this, right? That could kind of reclaim the power of Congress, start kind of pulling back. We really wouldn't have to wait till the midterm elections if we just had a few members of Congress right now willing to stand up and pull it. So I wanted to ask about this, kind of this term you mentioned, legal authoritarianism, which sounds not quite right when you put those two words together. But you talked about this in the address that you gave, and would you maybe just unpack that? What is it? How's it taking hold, and how is it part of how he's getting away with all of this?
Well, this gets back to the United States Supreme Court, right? He put three of the justices on the court. Mitch McConnell had gotten rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court justices, which it would have required a supermajority to get them on the court, which means you have to get a more moderate candidate. Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Barrett were all put on with bare Republican majorities, and they're on there for life. And they have just been giving him win after win. This they call it conservative. It's anything but conservative. But you've seen the Supreme Court greenlight what they're called Kavanaugh stops, racial profiling, notwithstanding the Fourth Amendment, greenlighting, lifting the due process clause, greenlighting Elon Musk coming in, ignoring all these statutes, Privacy Act, taking our data, closing agencies, USAID, it's cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So I think in the Project 2025 document created by the Heritage Foundation, this 900-page manifesto, the lawyers worked on that for 4 years. I mean, I can say, looking at it, it's very well lawyered, and they looked at the play in the joints in the law, the places where we don't really have law because we didn't think we needed law because presidents generally either followed it, or if they didn't, that was really hidden and secret. So they exploited the areas where there isn't any law, and then it leaves people saying, wait, where's the police officer on this corner? And then you've got the Supreme Court in bedrock principles of law that are in these emergency motions, uh, these emergency docket, shadow docket rulings, which some people call,
Yeah.
making major changes to the United States Constitution without much explanation. So it doesn't get a lot of coverage. And I should add too, Robbie, I think, lawyers, judges, legal academics are very uncomfortable criticizing the Supreme Court, and so I think when I say legal authoritarianism, this is just kind of unfolding really in dramatic ways, but we're stuck in a rule of law mentality and trying to explain it within a rule of law mentality that isn't really functioning anymore. So we have this
Yeah.
constitution, we have these laws, they're just being violated and they're not being enforced. And so that's when I say it's legal authoritarianism, because people still think the laws are there, but it's not actually functioning the way it was intended.
Yeah. I want to come back to the moral point here in a second, but I do want you to just pause and maybe help us understand a little bit more about, because I'm also learning. I'm not a constitutional expert, but I've been trying to kind of get up to speed on, like, okay, how does Supreme Court work? What is it? What actually is supposed to be happening? This you mentioned the what's often called the shadow docket. Could you just explain a little bit more about what that is and how it's being used in kind of unprecedented ways in this Trump administration to, yeah, just kind of move things along and without things getting on the record, without there being extended argument, and like what's happening there? What is it and what's happening there?
Yeah, so I cover these kinds of really basic questions in my Substack, which I know you mentioned, for anybody who wants some more deeper
Yep.
dive, or my
The
book on
little
the
law
Constitution.
school.
Yeah,
Yes.
Little Law School, or How to Read the Constitution, and why it's like assigned in a lot of law schools and first year universities to break this down. But essentially, the Supreme Court's an appellate court. That means the record, that is the facts, evidence, witnesses, all of that is done in the lower courts. And then they're supposed to just kind of grade the papers of the lower courts. And that takes a really long time. You have to wait till it percolates in the trial level court, then the appellate court, then you file what's called a petition for certiorari. Thousands of them, I think 4,000 a year, they take 80 cases. And then there's massive briefing. It takes months. Amicus, friends of the court, file requests to, the Better Business Bureau might weigh in, or a religious organization might weigh in, or historians might weigh in. And then you have oral argument, and they produce these massive opinions. And the idea is, when the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, it's basically amending it because it's the highest authority on the Constitution. So you really want lots of buy-in and lots of explanation as to what it's doing. So that's the normal way. There is a mechanism to ask for emergency relief from the court and to jump over all those steps. A classic example would be, I'm on death row. My execution is tomorrow morning. I have really good arguments for why my conviction violated the Constitution. There's no time to go through all of that appellate process. So please, court, can you come in and um, just stay the execution, stay the lower courts, do a freeze on everything until I can actually have my case heard? Donald Trump's been using that to say, my emergency as president is that I have to wait. So it's an emergency that a lower court is issuing an injunction, for example, preventing me from denying people birthright citizenship. Or it's an emergency that a lower court is issued an injunction basically telling me that I can't let an airplane take off with a bunch of migrants who did not get any judicial review and are being sent to South Sudan. Um, so the emergency, the gift that keeps on giving, is the idea that I don't want to have to wait for the normal legal process. That's not an emergency. And there's actually a 4-part test the court should be applying before they cherry pick these cases as if, okay, it's really for extreme cases. I'm going to be executed. And so Trump, in over 20 cases last year, has been using this emergency mechanism, going to the court. The court stays the lower court, halts it, and lets Donald Trump basically do what he wants while the case goes through all those wickets that I was mentioning. But they've given him the relief that he gets the grand prize, and the damage is already done. The people are already in South Sudan. There are migrants that have already been arrested and thrown in detention camps, notwithstanding that the only basis was that they were speaking Spanish and they had brown skin, which would violate not only the Fourth Amendment, but probably the Equal Protection Clause. So, and the other thing is, because it's emergency, so they're not explaining what they're doing. So lower courts don't really know what the law is, and the media doesn't really cover it because it's just one of these temporary decisions when actually the implications are massive.
Yeah. I want to pause on this. I mean, what's interesting, we've actually polled on this a bit, and what's I think kind of shocking here is how Republicans, self-identified Republicans, are such outliers from the rest of the country, right? So we talk a lot about polarization in the country, but what we really are seeing is a kind of movement of the Republican Party out of mainstream America and further to the right. So I'll just give you 2 quick examples here. So we asked about whether the federal government should be able to detain immigrants who are in the country illegally in internment camps, right? And again, as a pollster, not a question I really thought I'd need to be asking in the United States of America, but here we are, right? So we asked the question. So it turns out that it is 37% of Americans who agree with that statement. It's more than 6 in 10 who disagree. But if you look at the partisan splits, it is Republicans on one side and independents and Democrats on the other. So it's not an even polarization. It really is independents and Democrats over here, or Republicans over there and everybody else over here. So maybe probably the better way to say it. So Republicans, 69% of Republicans say they agree that the federal government should detain immigrants who are in the country illegally in internment camps so they can be deported. It's less than a third of independents. It's only 13% of Democrats. And very similar that you mentioned foreign rendition. We pulled on that. U.S. government deporting undocumented immigrants to foreign prisons, and we even named them in the polling question in El Salvador, Rwanda, and Libya without allowing them to challenge their deportation in court. So we even included the no due process thing. It's less than a third of Americans who support that, but it is 62% of Republicans. It's only a quarter of independents, only 10% of Democrats. So it really is this again. It's not that we're polarized. It really is that you've got Republicans moving further and further to the right as they become the MAGA party of Trump, and really the illiberal, anti-democratic, authoritarian party of Trump, and all other Americans kind of over on the other side. But as you said, when they have taken the apparatus of the Supreme Court and Congress, you can have a minority of the country, right, that's pulling these levers, just only in one direction.
I think that was understood, by Mitch McConnell and, sort of legacy Republicans that if they capture the Supreme Court, then you can have minority rule because, as I said earlier, people don't understand this. It takes supermajorities in both houses of Congress and in the states to amend the Constitution. It takes 5 justices. So all you have to do is get your people on the court, and they can basically amend the Constitution. I would add one other question for you. I don't know if you've asked this, but I'm curious, which is, how would people respond if instead of saying arrest migrants and immigrants and put them in detention camps, arrest dissidents, arrest American citizens? Because what people don't understand, I think maybe some do, some don't, is that, the Constitution isn't self-selecting. That is, once you suspend the Due Process Clause, once you suspend the First Amendment, once you suspend the Fourth Amendment, it's not just suspended for Democrats or immigrants. It's suspended for everybody. And then you've got to just hope you have a benevolent dictator. That's a really scary place to be. And, they're coming for brown and black people today, but they could be coming for you next once the structure is gone. People don't live forever. And I'd be really curious if you
Yeah.
just played with the words, if those percentages would be different.
Yeah. So we haven't asked about that directly, but absolutely right, right? That this is where the playing field is starting, but it's not where it's going to end, for sure. Along these lines, I wanted to ask you about this. You mentioned actually in your talk, this White House memorandum that did get some press, but then of course with everything else going on, I think it didn't get sustained attention. But on the point of dissidents, and people exercising their First Amendment rights to speak out against this administration and organize against the excesses and the lawlessness of this administration. The White House issued this memorandum called, and it was has this little NSPM-7. That was really chilling when I read it. And I'm not a lawyer, but it was clear enough even to me that like what this was really up to. That directed law enforcement to investigate and uproot organizations promoting anti-fascism and, wait for it, anti-Americanism. So maybe you talk a little bit about that. And like, yeah, you've got that. You've got concentration camps being set up with this $75 billion bill funding ICE. What dot should we, or what line should we be, or dot should we be connecting here between these things?
Yeah, so people are, I think, looking for, as I mentioned, lights in the end, in the tunnel. And they've said, okay, that NSPM-7 came out, and we're not seeing a lot of arrests of journalists. There's been a few. There've been vindictive prosecutions, but they failed. The courts are holding. Grand juries aren't indicting. And so maybe, but what that memorandum does is essentially allows the government, or de facto declares anyone who falls in whatever anti-American is, which would be the definition that I think Donald Trump and the people that have the power in America right now would make it, domestic terrorists. There's a federal law that once someone is declared a terrorist, but that's a cell that actually is connected to a foreign terrorist group, then there are much broader powers of surveillance that are triggered. There is no mechanism for declaring American citizens terrorists in the same way because we have a First Amendment that protects terrorists. Excuse me, that protects Americans from being declared terrorists. So this is using the rhetoric of terrorism to identify dissidents, Democrats, people on the left, moderates, and people with certain ideological, religious, who knows,
Well, even it even
inclinations,
names yeah, even
enemies of
names
the state. Mhm.
people who don't have traditional views on the family.
There you
It
go.
even names in that memo, which I mean, that's pretty clear. So if you support LGBTQ rights, if you support any sort of like non-heterosexual family structures, any of that, if probably if you don't support that vision of hierarchical gender roles, right, you could run afoul of that definition. So I mean, it's incredibly broad, and even if it's not used first against individuals, it'll probably be used against organizations to defund them, freeze their bank accounts, like all of that sort of stuff. That's
Yeah, and you talked about the detention camps. I mean, the
yeah,
billions of dollars, and they're building, they're, all across the country, they're buying, old sort of Amazon type style warehouses, putting thousands of detention beds. We have a lot of people, migrants in the United States. Some of them are here with documentation, some are not. But my concern is, that it's not a far leap that some of those spaces would not be necessarily reserved for migrants, particularly if they're not
yeah,
just they're not being sure when ICE is picking up, and we know this already, that they're only taking people that have criminal convictions or even people that are not documented. I mean, that's a problem. But there are errors in picking up people that are, or at least not even checking to see if people actually are full blown American citizens. And then you're getting into pure, racial profiling. That an American citizen that's white is more valuable than an American citizen that's brown. I mean, but of course, the two people that were murdered in Minneapolis, they're white American citizens.
yeah,
So it's a very, very slippery slope, and I know it's extremely frightening, Robbie, for people to hear this. But as I say, if you've got stage 4 cancer, being kept in the dark about it by your doctor and just not being told because it's going to upset you, that's not a good strategy for staying alive and healthy. And I likewise don't think it's a good strategy for American democracy to say, "Oh, I don't want to deal with it. It's too stressful and scary." That's not going to turn the ship around.
yeah. Well, let me ask you, the question is, what can we do? How can we, if we see that the Constitution's not quite holding, the laws are not equipped to deal with this sort of bad actor, really, from the top down? I mean, that's really part of the problem is there is this assumption that at least, there'll be some ability that our elected leaders will act in good faith, right? And then when that falls out of, then all bets are off when we have someone who's just not even pretending to be acting in good faith. So, what can we do? How can we sort of shore up the laws? What role can citizens play? I think, and strengthening these structures as they're just openly being attacked.
People are looking at Minneapolis, what happened with the citizens of Minneapolis, and taking hope from that. But I would say, I'm not from Minneapolis. But they had to, right? Their kids were being, and their neighborhoods and their friends and their were being assaulted. They were under siege. And so I think it's an element of when people, when the stormtroopers are at your back door, people can come together, and we will. As Americans, I think we will. I guess I would say maybe not wait till it gets to that point. And I think this, I've been saying this for years now, being in this space for 10 years, and it seems like cold comfort, but everybody does want to do something. Number one is educate yourself about what's going on as hard as it is. Identify, real sources of information that aren't fake. It's getting harder and harder, aren't biased. Of course, there's a crackdown on the media. So even legacy journalists are now quiet, or at least the outlets are sort of sorting the information. And number two is have hard conversations with people. Bring up these things, even if it's not polite conversation. Of course, vote. That's, I don't think if the Democrats do take the House, that's going to be a panacea and that's going to resolve things. Um, but that's absolutely crucial and vital to, at least as a minimum, be sure that you do that. But it really is, I guess, I don't have a magic answer to it because we've never been at this point, I think, certainly in American history or even human history. And so because of that, I think if we can all come together collectively and make this our problem, that make it your problem in your life somehow, that it goes to the top of your list because it does affect the future of your children or even just the day to day of your children. I think once that happens, collectively we will come up with a solution. It's like what happened in Minneapolis. Collectively, these systems became in place. They just organically evolved. We saw this with the George Floyd. We saw this with Me Too. But it really takes enough people talking about it and saying, gosh, this is a problem. What are we going to do? And then collectively, I think we will come together and turn it around. I'm not sure how you get from A to B, but I'm confident it will. If millions, 11, 12, 13 million people make this their problem tomorrow, whether it be through boycotting some of these oligarchs that are supporting this administration, if it's putting pressure on your elected representatives. You say it's only a handful of Republicans, but it's also Democrats. They are not fighting fire with fire. They are not. I mean, they put a lot of this cabinet. There are Democrats who voted for
Yeah.
members of this cabinet. There are Democrats who voted until the murder of Alex Preddy. There were Democrats who voted for additional funding for ICE. There are, Democrats who could be, basically boycotting Congress until they hear their colleagues start complying with the United States Constitution. There are ways to push back in a radical way without violence. And I don't think our elected leaders on either side of the aisle are feeling that pressure. I do think members of Congress could do something, but they're not going to do it, and they can't be expected to do it without the support of their constituents. It's not fair to say they should be fixing that for us. Well, I stay home and feel comfortable and go on vacation and, worry about, what I'm having for dinner next week. And I don't mean to minimize people's troubles because people have really very, very serious things going on in their lives. But it's not just those Democratic members of Congress, particularly when their own families and their own safety can be threatened to the extent to which they really push back.
Yeah. Um, I agree with you. And I think what I'd like to echo what you said about, like, we've got to all make this our problem because it is our problem. And it is hard, I think, sometimes, kind of go through day to day, but just think about what we've lost in a year. Right? I mean, and just to kind of step back and say, "Oh my god, like, it has really only been a year." Right? And all the things that have been plowed under, in this last year, and all the things that will be plowed over in this coming year if we don't kind of stand up now. And so a couple of things I actually saw, is, boy, we can't also wait and think that the midterms by themselves in some magical way, right, are going to fix this, because if we don't do something now between now and the midterms, I'm not sure we're going to have free and fair midterms. We're going to need poll workers. We're going to need kind of to harden those elections so that we have free and fair elections and kind of prevent some of the mischief. And we're going to need to do that ahead of time, not wait till afterward. Think, oh, well, if we get the vote right, we'll fix it. I think we'll have to kind of first protect the vote, so that we can kind of get to
Yeah.
a vote there.
I mean, somebody mentioned the Epstein files, and also someone mentioned there are many people fighting this. And I agree. We just need many more. And I just want to celebrate the people that are in the
Yeah,
arena, like you and I are in. But I just want to make a point about the Epstein files, which is that the stuff that has come out um, is some of the most horrific uh, thing. I mean, it's not even in popular television or movies. It's so horrific and inhumane, and the level of depravity it's around children. It's just it's unspeakable. Um, that we cannot normalize that. We can't let that go into our collective consciousness as, oh, just, okay, that happened, and we're just going to let it sit there and move through it. I think that's very, very dangerous, because then that becomes something that politicians and people in power just do. So I don't have an answer on that. That's a very tricky thing. But if there is something from any of these stories that you think you can tell Aunt Millie, who is still in your 62% or whatever the percentage is of the Republicans that are down for fascism, that will get them to really think about this differently. Um, I think it's worth having those conversations because we are seeing more and more people, I think, as well, saying, listen, this isn't what I voted for. I
Yeah,
really
that's
didn't
right.
mean that. I did not mean that. So there's opportunity for bridging that I don't think existed 2 years ago, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other I've said often, we gotta look for the bright lines, and there's so many lines being crossed, but, we gotta pick a few that are bright lines. Yeah, I think the Epstein files are definitely a bright line. The other one we've already mentioned, I would say, is concentration camps. Like, that should be a bright line that's easy for people to grasp, that, like, we're like, "Oh, we know what happens when we go down that road." Like, we've been there, and we took pride in being on the other side of that, right, of the liberators of concentration camps in World War II. And but we've got funding in this bill for ICE to the last estimates I look at 50,000 beds in concentration camps that have already been funded for ICE to build.
Well, in ProPublica, I think it was ProPublica. I mean, there is reporting out there
Yeah,
about the hundreds, if not thousands, of children that are in these concentration camps already. That they're suicidal. They're not getting education. There's not decent health care. People who need chemo, pregnant women, people who need dialysis. It's not happening. So, I mean, what can you can do? You can let people know we have concentration camps in the United States with children in them in this moment. So
yeah,
just even sharing that, identifying the source of that and letting somebody know, did you realize this is happening? Is this okay with you? That is not getting reported in the mainstream press the way it might have before all of these defamation lawsuits, all of the pressure, the First Amendment, infractions that are happening. I think, big legacy media is worried about their bottom line and thankfully the safety and security of their people.
yeah.
So it's on us. It's on us to share this
Yeah, and
information.
I also think, the other thing to and we are seeing some I wanna salute some of the, things that we're already seeing. We are seeing, for example, when people get wind that one of these, warehouses is about to be converted into what they're calling detention centers, but are really concentration camps, people are protesting and saying, "No, no, 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 you're not doing that in our community." And I think that and it's always easier to do that before the thing gets built and barbed wire gets put around it and it's staffed with people with guns, right? But when it's I think right now when they're trying to do it, that's the time to stand up and say, "No, we're not doing that here." And so if we had that happening all local, and it is happening, I think that's going to be really, really key. I see one note here from Patrick asked about the great replacement theory. I'd say a little bit about that. Um, so this is something used to be on the fringe of the far right, and you would hear it and you would see. I mean, people would denounce it, right, rightly as a white supremacist, mindset. Tucker Carlson mainstreamed it through Fox News, and now it's become essentially a Republican talking point and a white Christian nationalism talking point. So it basically is this idea that Democrats are bringing in black and brown people from around the world to kind of change the demographics and take over the country. And that, replacement, who's being replaced? Well, real Americans who happen to be white and Christian. Like that's basically the idea. Unfortunately, what we see again, it really is remarkable. Most Americans absolutely reject that viewpoint. In fact, it's 2-to-1 Americans reject it. We polled on it, so we've asked, do you agree or disagree? And we put the statement as it exists on those kind of on the right. It was this statement: immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. Do you agree or disagree? Again, it's only about a third of Americans who agree with that, but it is a super majority of Republicans. It is a super majority of white evangelicals, and it's a super majority of people who hold a white Christian nationalist viewpoint. But again, it's independents, Democrats, other religious Americans, non-white Christian Americans, everybody else on the other side. And it's just this same picture. It's another way, another way of seeing this idea that really is at the core of a lot of this. Like, what is it about? It really is about preserving an America that is essentially a promised land for white Christian people. That's the worldview.
Well, I would say, it's the great replacement or the great switcheroo in another way. I mean, in the last 20, 30 years, wealth has gone exponentially from the middle and lower classes to the billionaires, to the top 1%. And so, they've managed at the same time to blame the implications of that wealth inequality on immigrants and these people, when actually to
Yeah.
blame is the people in power in this moment, the billionaires, the corporations, and this president has profited to the tune of billions since he took office in January of 2025. That's another way the Constitution's not functioning. There are two emoluments clauses that ban, in theory, goodies to you personally for being president, and it's the United States Congress that is specifically tasked in the Constitution for enforcing that. They're just not doing it. But I think, yeah, another way that and I don't even want to say Democrats, but the anti-authoritarians, pro-democracy groups can push back is just to name some of these things. The bad guys are not the people that are working in some of these jobs that other Americans don't want to have. The migrants that are working really hard. The bad guys are the ones that are bilking the American taxpayer and making life a lot harder, but enriching themselves. And they're the ones that were standing with Donald Trump on the dais when he took office, and not just them, but others. Under Donald Trump, his first term, corporations, their taxes went down. Well, has that
Yeah.
gotten better for anybody? That's the great replacement theory. We're replacing people with corporations in this country.
Yeah, well, it's a classic. I think somebody actually in the chat put something about Lyndon Johnson and kind of back. If we go back to the civil rights era, I mean, this was oh, there it is. Patrick put it back in there. Yeah, this classic scapegoating
Yep.
tactic, right? So it was black people in the civil rights movement, and now it's immigrants. In Germany, it was Jews, right? I mean, is this kind of classic scapegoating authoritarian trope? You always need someone to blame, right? And it has to be and someone to other. That's really always part of the formula that we're seeing here. And
Yeah, and it's a big distraction, right? It's like
yeah,
shiny object, squirrel, squirrel, squirrel. So people focus on that and they don't see to the point of Lyndon B. Johnson's that, yeah, their wallet's gone.
yeah, absolutely. Well, we're coming close to time here, but somebody said, how can we kind of keep finding each other? I'm hoping that we're providing one little hub for that right here, for people finding themselves, finding community on Facebook that can get translated, into action on the ground. The other thing I would say is that there are people in your community. Find your people in your community, because I do think the local organizing is going to be what we're going to need more and more. So, find the people in your community that are there. You can find that No Kings. You can find them in many churches that are actually taking stands, and many that haven't been taking stands before are finally stepping up. And I've been really heartened to see that. And I'm getting invitations, for example, to speak at places I never thought I would get asked, and a lot of white Christian churches that are finally saying, "Oh, wait, yeah, no, no, we didn't vote for this. We didn't want this, and we're going to have to put, our bodies on the line, our money on the line to kind of help hold the line." So what would you want to leave people with, Kim, on your side?
Yeah, well, likewise, please follow and read and educate on the legal side. I'm here to help with that and to translate some of these concepts into regular common sense terms. But to your point, I would say, you know, sometimes finding groups can be a little bit daunting. Create your own. I mean, one thing you can do is get two, three, four, five of your friends together once a week or twice a month to sit down and have conversations about hard stuff. Everybody brings something to talk about. You identify how you find your sources so they're accurate, and you start the conversation, and then one thing leads to another thing leads to another. I think that's really a concrete thing. Face to face is always really good, so that you can really be in community around it. Online is great, but it's not the same. And I think that's one of the things that we've lost in our culture is the face to face connection. COVID made it even harder, and the powers of authoritarianism exploit that. So I really encourage people to use this moment of isolation and fear to find each other and build community, because it's that human interaction which is really the foundation of our species, right? That's the part. That's the part that's the most crucial.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Kim. Thanks for all of your work, for sharing your expertise with us here today. It is the Little Law School is Kim's Substack. You can find there her books as well. Thank you all for joining. I just put a link about an event that we are holding tomorrow at PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute. So I want to flag this for you. If you're interested in finding out more about Christian nationalism and the role that it's playing in this authoritarian regime, we at PRI are releasing a massive 22,000 person data set where we have analyzed the prevalence of Christian nationalism in all 50 states. So we will have maps, we will have trend lines, we will have all kinds of breakdowns of the data. That's being released tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. The link is in the chat. We will have as our guest Ruth Ben Giat, author of Strongman. Many of you may have read her book. She's going to be commenting on the data, as well as Father Brian Massengale, who's a professor of theology at Fordham University, talking about the ways that this has made inroads in the Catholic Church as well. And we'll also be trying to turn it to solutions in that webinar as well. So thank you for joining us here. Always, again, the Little Law School, Kim Whaley, and hopefully you will also subscribe to Redeeming Democracy. That's my Substack, and we will do this again soon. So thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks for having me, Robbie. Bye, everyone.